I'll do a quick intro for the next speaker, because I have a very interesting story on how I met Rohan actually. So because since we met Rohan as a colleague, and basically when we got acquired by Telenav, he started there as the head of the product management at Telenav. So we went out for dinner and he took me to a really nice place in Palo Alto, which I'm still very grateful for, and he paid the bill at the end, which also helped to make it a nice experience for me. But the most important thing is I asked him, of course, so how do we make the Telenav product really successful? And what he told me was a bit puzzling. He said, I don't know. He said, oh great, Telenav invested in getting a guy on stage who doesn't know how to make the product successful. That's interesting. But then of course came more. He said, I don't know yet, but I know very well how we can develop a path in order to have a successful product. And I think that's what it was all about. So he said that it's not really from the beginning that he knew exactly how to make it successful, but he knew how he can find out how to make it successful. And that's, I think, what the talk today will focus on, how you can use data to make data-driven decisions and come to a way where you have a really deep understanding of the product, and based on that data then make a decision. So I think that's one thing which I learned from Rohan, and he's, I think, one of the best experts in the world to learn about that topic. So really listen carefully and learn how you can build your products and build a really fast learning cycle.
Right. Thanks for the almost perfect intro. It's not every day you get to be introduced by royalty. I've heard, Philip, that you're known locally as the King of Cluj, so that's pretty special. And thanks for the bit about, hey, he didn't know what he's doing. I think that's a great setup for the talk. So, I'm up here fundamentally because I've failed a lot, as I said earlier. And don't feel bad for me, I've also been lucky enough that some of those failures converted into success. But the great thing about that journey has been you get to do a lot of learning on the way. Now that said, I think there was a gentleman up earlier, Robert, I think his name was, who said he'd been fortunate enough to only know success. So I will say that is the best way to learn, if you can be successful all the way through. But there's a lot to be taken out of failures. And from the ones I've had, the one thing I've learned above all is that the thing that matters most when you're building up your company and really working in a company as well is the ability to make decisions. And I've learned to value that probably above anything else in my career. And it's not an easy thing to do. Every day, every iteration you make in your product, every meeting you're in, it's all about making that choice and navigating that path forward and thinking about what you're doing next and often what not to do next. It's probably, as I said, the most important skill I've developed. And it's really difficult, as this guy once said many years ago. It's something you have to do, but it's not easily done, and it's not something that comes as naturally to us as we might think. Now, Napoleon in his time, he had secret weapons that he used as such to progress in his wars and in his plan to conquer the world. One of the weapons he used was weapons, maybe the wrong word, the telegraph. And what the telegraph gave him was the ability to get information from the front lines back and forth very quickly, and to use that information to make the decisions he needed to make. And so really from his time and onwards, data has shaped the world that we live in. And I think there's a huge opportunity for each of you, and I've watched the hackathon yesterday and listened to the questions you guys are asking. There's a lot of creative intelligence here. And I think if you find the right ways to incorporate data into driving how you're building your companies, building your products, you can do some great things. So, from my experience, I'm going to use the next 17 and a half minutes, and hopefully a little less than that, because it's getting on in the day, to try and give you some thoughts on the how, the when, and the why you should use data to drive your decision making. So, every good presentation has to have a warm, fuzzy animal, and for mine, I've chosen the hippo. So the hippo is often referred to as the most dangerous animal in the world. He's a really loud and obnoxious creature, very unpredictable. And the one thing about the hippo is when he's got his body of water that he's aiming for, that he's trying to get to, he's going to do anything to get there. He'll trample you, he'll bite you. And he wants to make himself heard, and he wants to take charge and take control. And the reason I talk about the hippo is he represents an all too common way for decision making to happen. And it happens in big companies, in small companies, in startups. And that is relying on the highest paid person's opinions. So how many of you guys have experienced that in your careers? You guys are pretty lucky, only a handful. I think I've seen this at, frankly, every company I've worked at. I'll obviously exclude Telenav with HP, who you heard earlier, who's just way above that. But you know, unless that person in your company is Steve Jobs and he's in the position of making the decision, and we've seen even he got it wrong once or twice, it's really hard to function that way, and it's not a constructive way to function. I felt that pain acutely a couple of times. You know, probably my first company I worked for, I was one of these guys with an inflated title, as Marcus alluded to in the morning, and you know, I was the VP of engineering of this startup. And we had a chief architect who was my peer, and we battled a lot on a big architectural decision. And in the end, it turned into an emotional battle between us. And he was paid more than I was, so he had the ability to pull rank. And when it became an emotional battle, it was his rank over mine, so he made the call. A year later, we were the subject of a $100 million acquisition offer, and things were progressing really well. When the due diligence came in, things went really well until they looked at that one architectural component. And we actually lost that acquisition offer on that basis. And this is not to throw that guy under the bus, he was a really bright guy. But we made a decision based on emotion, and for my part, I learned a really big lesson that day, which was countering that hippo syndrome cannot be done on the basis of emotion. It can't be, hey, I've got a different opinion from you. I've got to use data. And I learned that from that day, rational discourse is what's going to win out. Again, unless maybe you're Steve Jobs. So once you've decided to let the data do the talking, the next thing you're going to have to look at is your ego. You know, Marcus referenced the titles earlier, and founders of startups wanting to be the CEO and CTO and not wanting to take lower titles, struggling with bringing people in above them. And this ego problem translates into product decisioning as well. We've all got it, right? Whether you feel you have it or not, it's just a matter of how you keep it under control. Because we have our pet ideas, our notions of what might work, and we let those take control. And in reality, it's not about being the person with the original idea, right? It's about executing brilliantly. Apple didn't invent the MP3 player, they didn't invent the mobile phone, they didn't invent the mobile app, but the iPhone won the battle. And you know, neither did Samsung invent those things, and those are the two dominant players there. So there was no ego on any of their parts about what product they should build. They looked at the market, they looked at data, they saw the opportunity, and they came up with a creative solution. This is what you need to be doing with your ego. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with the Burning Man festival in California, but that's where this comes from. And it's a lot harder to do than you think, because as I said, emotions will get the better of you, but you need to let it go, because you've got to get used to the fact that you will be wrong. You will fail, your ideas will fail, someone else's ideas will take hold, and that's great, right? Because it's not about you having the idea, it's about the result that you get to. And I've been doing this for a while, and I still have to remind myself every day not to get attached to these things. And if you're really smart, you'll let other people's ideas do the talking, right? Data and learning that you can get from others. So another concept I want to introduce is the concept of the desire path. This is something that comes from the world of landscape architecture. And when people build a park, I think this one is in Barcelona, there's all kinds of design and architectural work that goes into it, and they build paths around it and through it in certain ways. And yet what happens is you see in this picture, right? The kids and everyone else, they walk across this unpaved portion of the grass, and the grass gets downtrodden and this mud path emerges. And this is a concept that translates really well into product development. I think a few people have talked earlier about how you've got to put your product out in the market to learn from your users, and that's what this is really about. You don't always know the way that your product's going to get used, but your users will tell you as they use it. And some of the best products are where an open canvas has been provided, and you start to learn how people engage with it, and take that and look at that data and translate that into how you evolve your product. I think a great example is on the iPhone itself. One of the most popular apps in the early days was the flashlight apps on the iPhone. And they were consistently in the top 50, top 20, and top 10 free apps on the App Store. Now, when Apple designed the iPhone, they didn't really envision that people like me were going to use it at night to check on their baby sleeping in the room and turn on the light. And if you now look at iOS 7, it's now built into that iPhone. You just have to pull out the drawer and you turn on the flashlight. And those flashlight apps are history, right? Whatever money they were making from ads is gone. And that's an example of a company like Apple learning from the desire path that was expressed by their users. It's not something that was their idea, but they took that learning and built it into their product. And there's no shame in that, right? Only glory. I forgot I had the clicker. So the other thing I'd say is measure everything. And you know, I'm a data-obsessed guy, so people argue that I go on the extreme on this, but I think this is a fundamentally critical discipline for whatever you're doing with your products. I used to say earlier in my career that if you can't report on something, it doesn't exist. I think that's a little too simplistic because that closes you to the notion of dealing with situations where you don't have data, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But you do want to make sure you're never in a situation where you want for data because you didn't bother to instrument your product or your service appropriately. A lot of people will tell you only to track data that you're going to act on, but we're in an era where storage is cheap, tracking is easy, so make sure you're instrumenting everything you do. So that's a bunch of high-level principles. How do you decide what metrics to report on and use, and how do you go about that process? So here's a game of football going on. I don't know how many football fans we have in the audience, but we're in an appropriate arena for this. I couldn't find a picture of you Cluj playing. But does anyone see the problem in this picture?
Yeah. Where's the gate?
There's no goal, right? How does this team organize? How does it move forward? How does it decide what it's aiming for? And how does it organize its strategy and tactic? The first thing you've got to do with every product, with every feature, every even micro feature that you build, is establish the goals and objectives. If you don't have something that you're trying to do, your team, have really no idea what it is you're looking for. So, to give you an example, to sort of encapsulate the points I'm going to make, this is a feature we're trying to build into our Telenav Scout app. And the goal we set up was to help people find things while they navigate. And you can see, I don't know how clearly you can see, but from this experience, it's a problematic thing. So, you know, in the screen you can see the arrow, the driver's on the freeway, they've searched for coffee. And actually every coffee shop that's being highlighted is something that's at an exit they've already passed and it's behind them. So it's a really poor, inconvenient experience. But why did we choose this as an important goal? This is where the data starts to come in. So for us, this was actually a desire path that emerged. And we looked at what people were doing while they were navigating, and they were trying like hell to search for coffee and search for gas, petrol. And they were struggling with it, because what we were finding was they were doing that, but they weren't really consummating that experience. So we had to do something about it. And so once you've established the goal, next thing you need to do is define the value proposition that you're serving against that goal and your strategy behind it. How are you actually going to achieve this? So again, in our case, what we said was we're looking at people searching for something while they're driving. Let's constrain it on searching along their route and making sure they're finding something that minimizes the disruption they have to their ultimate destination and is really easy for them to handle. Now, it's important to note here, right, that the data didn't tell us what the solution was going to be. What it helped us do through the desire path was identify the problem that we wanted to tackle. Then comes the big question. What are the metrics that you put in against this? This is where the focus around the goal comes from, where you can measure it and you and your team can look up every day and say, here's how I'm doing against that goal, here's what I need to do to get better at it. So the obvious thing that everyone tends to go for is, let's get a bunch of KPIs around this, key performance indicators. The problem is, I think far too many people tend to stop there. And that's where things start to unravel, because the problem with a KPI is it's fundamentally a trailing indicator. If I look at how many users of my app I've got, that tells me the outcome of all the things I've put in. But it's not actionable. It's like knowing the score of the football game after the fact. I can't now do anything to help me achieve that goal a lot better. What KPIs are ultimately built out of are leading indicators. And these are the metrics that you need to be looking for, which are actionable and tell you how to progress with respect to your goal. They give you the points of influence and impact that you can have. So there are 4 key things that you need to look for in defining a leading indicator. And again, these are the metrics that are going to be most important in your product. The first is that it's predictive. As I said, the importance of the leading indicator is that it tells you what is going to happen, not what has happened. So if you look at, say, the stock market or just economic growth in general, an unemployment index is a great leading indicator for that. Every month when the unemployment numbers come out, that gives you a good hint of where the market's going to go and where economic growth is going. Next thing, of course, is that it has to be measurable. I think this one is self-explanatory. It goes without saying that if you can't measure it, there's not a lot of action you're going to be able to take on it. The third is that it has to be persistent and continuous. It's got to be something that you can keep on measuring. It's not a one-off thing, so that you can track and watch the progress. And the fourth is, of course, that it is something actionable. You've got to be able to do something about it. So I'll give you an example to try and illustrate that. Suppose your objective is to live healthy and lose weight. The sort of natural metric that everyone looks at is, well, I'll step on the scales every morning and see how much I weigh. But if you look at your weight, it's not a predictive measure, right? It's a post-facto measure of your results. It's measurable, it's persistent, you can weigh yourself every day, but again, it's not actionable. The weight is the outcome. Instead, the metric that you need to be focusing on is your calorie consumption versus your calories out. It's predictive because I can tell you that if you take in more calories than you burn, you're going to increase weight and vice versa. It's measurable because we know the caloric content of all our food, or as we do nowadays. It's persistent because you can measure that with and understand the values with every bite you eat and every meal you consume. And it's directly actionable because you can control that by adjusting what you eat. So that's an example of the kind of metric you need to get to. If we go back to the example I used from Scout of the navigation and searching ahead, we had our KPI of visit frequency, how are people looking at the app. And by the way, as I look at this, I realize this is a really lousy example of a chart on the left. So it looks like our visit frequency is actually double there, but that's because the scale doesn't start at 0. So that's another little thing to watch for when you're looking at data, is make sure you're looking at it in context correctly. But the leading indicators are the key, and the leading indicator for us in this case was, are people actually adding that stop on their route and successfully driving there and continuing their route? And as you see people doing that, that's a sign, especially compared to where we were before, that you've got success happening. And fundamentally, I group these leading indicators for an app like ours into a notion of a success ratio. Ultimately, if every time someone comes into your app, if they're having a successful outcome or a successful event, that's going to be a leading indicator and predictive of whether they'll come back and keep using it again. And in our case, our numbers on that went from less than 10% to over 35% success. Now that's not a win yet, right? So that piece of data tells me that 2/3 of people are still failing, even though they have this intent to do a search. That tells me there's a lot more that we need to do on that product. Another thing I want to say about data is you've got to choose your metrics really wisely and really carefully. So if you look at this chart, this is a chart of Internet Explorer, web browser usage. So how many people here use Chrome or Firefox as their primary browser? Who doesn't? One person shocking. I actually didn't think we'd get a single one. But the data shows, if you look at it, that 60% of the world is using Internet Explorer as their browser. And Chrome and Firefox account for just about a third of people. Now that seems shocking. If you look at it another way, and you look at the number of visits to web pages that come from the different browsers, the roles are completely reversed. And what does this tell you? Well, the challenge is, you're making a decision. Should I optimize for Internet Explorer, or should I optimize for Chrome or Firefox? If you look at the data wrong, you're potentially making completely the wrong decision. Now, it depends on what your goals and objectives are. If your objective is just a basic reach, and you want most users to be able to see the front of the site, then maybe you do want to optimize for Internet Explorer. If your objective is successful engagement, you may want to go the other way. And depending on what it is, you need to choose the right metric to look at. So here's the funny thing with all of this, right? So, and I say funny because I'm supposed to be this data-driven and obsessed guy. You've got to look a lot beyond the data. Data isn't everything. There's a lot that you can't see, and you don't always have time to wait for it. Imagine you're the captain of the Titanic approaching an iceberg, and you see this little clump of ice out there on the ocean. You've got to make a pretty quick decision as to whether you keep going or whether you turn the ship, because the Titanic, as we found out, is not a very easy thing to maneuver. Now you're going at 30 knots, you've got to make this decision. The one thing you can't do is say, I need a little bit more information, I'm going to send some divers out to check how big and deep this iceberg is. It's too late at that point. You've got to keep moving, because it's not a video game, you can't press pause. So, this is what happens if you press pause, right? Stagnation happens. When water goes stagnant, what happens? Mosquitoes breed, disease spreads, and there's sort of a disturbing of the surroundings. And that's what's going to happen to your product and your business if you don't make that decision. So what do you do when you don't have all the data, right? When you see that iceberg and you feel like this might just be the tip of the iceberg and there might be a lot more hidden that I don't know about. You have to make a call. So I'm kind of totally mixing my metaphors here with icebergs and this, and now I'm going to go into football. So check out this video for a second, if this works. So that's Cristiano Ronaldo taking a header, light switched out as someone takes the corner kick, and that ball has ended up in the goal. So I look at that and I completely marvel, right? I couldn't do that if I tried 100 times with the lights on. So how does he possibly do it with the lights off and with essentially all data and information stripped and absent? And the reason he can do it is because he trusted and yielded to his instincts. And that's, ironically, in a presentation about data, that may be one of the most important takeaways. In fact, if you take away one thing from this, I would say be prepared to yield to your instincts. It's a difficult thing to do when you're trying to be data-driven and trying to do the right thing and make the right decisions. But you've got to understand where instinct comes from, right? How did Ronaldo have that instinct? It's not because he was born with it. I mean, he was clearly born with skills that I don't have. But it's honed from, I don't know how many tens and hundreds of thousands of headers he's taken. When he saw the guy taking the corner running out to kick the ball, from that his instinct told him what was going to happen next, and he was able to score a goal. And you've got to use that in all the decisions you make, because you will, believe me, more often than you realize, not have data, particularly when you're starting out and building a new product. And it's tough to trust your instincts when you're 25, you haven't got a lot of theoretical experience out there in the field. Don't underestimate, especially for you guys, and you guys are a generation behind me for the most part. You guys have grown up in this digital era, and don't underestimate the sort of education and training that you've got from living with that, using all the other apps out there, using these devices every day, and back yourself when you're making those decisions. So I'm going to leave you with another animal. I started with the hippo, and I'm going to close with, it's not a dog, it's actually a dingo, which is a relative of the wolf. So they're not very popular in Australia because they're alleged to kidnap babies and great things like that, so they have a pretty rotten reputation. But actually they're a very intelligent animal, they're a very persistent animal. They're known in particular for their stamina and their ability to win battles over the long haul, and rather than for their speed. So what I'm going to advise you to do, in addition to yielding to your instincts, is to really let data and instincts rule and embrace the dingo and make sure you get rid of that hippo in your organization. And that's it.
German efficiency. Thank you very much, Rohan. Really appreciate it. Okay, so unfortunately we don't have time for Q&A, but maybe Rohan,
I'll be around if anyone has questions.
or if you need like a little bit of time for like setting it up, we can take one question. Okay, go ahead.
You seem like you weren't always that data-driven person. Maybe you weren't always in that data-driven mindset. Was it some change that happened, and was it something related to that ego you were talking about in the beginning?
I always had a big ego, so I learned to suppress it. That was pretty important. So I still have the big ego, I can just suppress it. Yeah, I think I was always my background is software engineering and computer science. I was a math geek as a kid, so I've always been obsessed with the data side of things. What I learned through that experience was a lot about how and when to use the data and let it come forth. So it's one thing to sort of privately look at charts and graphs and play around with the numbers. It's another thing to start applying it to the decisions you make. And these decisions aren't always made in a vacuum, right? It's actually easy when you're one person making a decision. When you're in an organization with a bunch of people, using the data and converting it into information and knowledge to sort of explain and persuade other people that, hey, this is the direction we should go versus that direction is an art, and it takes a while to learn that practice. But I think for me, that trigger point of that one experience which told me, hey, I screwed up, and I blame that on myself, not the other guy, for making the architectural decision, because we had the data that said that we should go this way rather than that, but we didn't really exploit it and use it and leverage it.
So does this help, like, dissolving other people's egos in front of that in-your-face data?
A lot, right? Because it's very, very easy to argue when you're arguing on an emotional level, and as I said with the hippo syndrome, right, the highest paid person can pretty much pull rank and say, we're just arguing, my opinion counts, I'm the boss, we're done. when you present data, data is ultimately, assuming you've done it correctly, it's incontrovertible, right? It represents facts, and it's very hard to argue against facts with emotion. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be a boss or a CEO in your life who will say, never mind the data, I want to do this anyway. And what you've got to do is sort of make sure that that is about instinct rather than emotion and opinion. Because as I said, right, there will be many times where you might actually see a mountain of data that says you should turn left, but something in your gut, because you've been down this road in a similar way before, tells you that, hey, turn right because there's a fire-breathing dragon on the left and I want to avoid it. And you've got to be willing to do that, ironically, in the face of that data. And so when you're being overruled in a data-driven argument, if you can be sure or convinced that the other guy is doing it because he has a valid instinct, great.
Okay, super.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rohan.